When was the last time you had a drink? Maybe it was at a party, or catching up with an old friend, an exhausting night after work, or simply because someone said, let's have a little drink for fun. It sounds so modern, so everyday, but if we look deeper, that action pulls us back to a distant past. So far back, it's hard to believe, about 13,000 years ago. In a rocky cave in the Mount Carmel region, Israel, humans left behind traces of a kind of drink, fermented from wild grains. The strange thing is, that evidence wasn't in a lively, crowded village. Nor was it next to a lavish banquet table. It was in the setting of a burial cave. So maybe humanity's very first glass of alcohol didn't start with laughter, but started with a ritual, a final farewell, or a very ancient need to just sit close together when life was simply too harsh. Alcohol isn't just something people drink. It's a trace of how humans learned to be together. If the traces in that Israeli burial cave show that humans knew how to brew so early on, then the next question is, how did they even think of that? Perhaps the answer doesn't start with a brilliant invention, but begins with a very natural accident. A fig falling to the ground, a bunch of overripe wild grapes, a little honey mixing with rainwater in a tree hollow. A few days later, the sweet smell turns pungent. The fruit flavor isn't fresh anymore, but a bit sour, a bit sharp. And if you ate enough of it, your body would start to feel different. That wasn't alcohol in the human-made sense yet. That was nature fermenting all on its own. Biologically speaking, yeast can turn sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Simply put, if you have sugar, moisture, time, and the right kind of microbes, nature was already making alcohol without needing human permission. Biologist Robert Dudley at the University of California once proposed the hypothesis of the drunken monkey. It suggests that human attraction to alcohol might be rooted very deeply in our primate ancestors eating ripe and fermented fruits. This is still just an evolutionary interpretation, not direct evidence of the very first drink, but it brings up a really fascinating point. Humans didn't invent alcohol. They discovered it and then learned how to keep it. Nature created alcohol. Humans created the gatherings around it. From the phenomenon of naturally fermented fruits, humans took another very crucial step. They weren't just stumbling upon alcohol anymore. They started making it. One of the most striking pieces of evidence lies in Raqefet Cave on Mount Carmel, Israel. Here, a research team that included Professor Li Lu from Stanford University analyzed the stone mortars of the Natufian people, a semi-sedentary hunter-gatherer community, living roughly 13,700 to 11,700 years ago. Inside those stone mortars, they found traces of starch, plant residues, and transformations consistent with the processing of fermented grains. To put it simply, the Natufians might have crushed wild seeds, processed them, and created a primitive, beer-like beverage. But don't go imagining a cold glass of beer, golden and full of foam. This stuff was probably thicker, cloudier, and lower in alcohol, closer to a kind of fermented grain porridge. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't chill, and definitely not the kind of drink you'd post on your story. The point that makes this story take a turn is the location of the evidence. Raqefet wasn't just a living space. It was a burial ground. So that very early fermented brew might not have started with a party. It might have started with rituals, from the memory of those who had passed away. And from the need to bring the living closer together, this completely shakes up a very familiar way of thinking. That humans had to farm first, and have a surplus of barley before they had the free time to even think about brewing beer. But Raqefet shows that this timeline isn't quite that simple anymore. The Natufians weren't fully fledged farmers yet. They were still hunter-gatherers, relying heavily on nature. But they had also started to settle down. They knew how to gather wild grains, and how to grind seeds using stone mortars. And it seems they even knew how to create a type of yeast for special occasions. In other words, alcohol isn't necessarily a byproduct of civilization. It might have appeared right at the borderline, exactly where humans started shifting from a wandering lifestyle into much tighter, closer-knit communities. And here is the really fascinating part. If making fermented drinks required so much time, effort, and preparation, then it definitely wasn't just to quench their thirst. A whole group of people had to agree that this was actually worth doing, worth grinding the seeds, worth the long wait, and worth sharing together. Maybe they weren't just looking for something to drink. They were looking for a reason to gather together. And if that's true, then alcohol didn't come after civilization. It stood right there at the exact moment when humans first learned how to live as us. Let's try to picture that moment. Not as a wild drinking party, but as a very quiet, peaceful night. Outside the cave, a cold wind sweeps across the mountain slopes. Inside, the low glow of the fire casts shadows upwards, against the cave walls, making the human shadows flicker as if they were breathing. Someone is bent over a stone mortar, slowly grinding away, grinding the tiny seeds they had spent days gathering. The scraping sound of dry stone rubbing against stone sounds almost like the very heartbeat of the cave itself. There are no glass bottles here, no banquet tables. There's no one shouting at you to chug your drink. There's only the smell of wood smoke, the scent of damp earth, the aroma of crushed seeds, and a mixture that is just patiently waiting to change its flavor. Nearby, there might even be a resting place for the dead. So, if that special drink was being passed around, perhaps it wasn't meant to get anyone completely wasted. It was more of a shared act, tasting a strange new flavor together, remembering someone together, confirming together that this group is still here. 141 0小时04分58秒 433大于0小时04分59秒 166 Alcohol back then didn't need to be fancy. It just needed to be there at the right time. And from small moments like that, yeast began to step out of the caves to enter pottery jugs, harvests, festivals, and larger communities. When yeast stepped out of those caves, it didn't follow a single path. Over in Jiahu, a Neolithic village in Henan province, China, pottery fragments show that about 9,000 years ago, people created a fermented drink from rice, honey, and fruit. It wasn't quite beer, and not exactly wine. It was more like a hybrid recipe made from whatever their environment provided. Further west, in the Caucasus region, traces found in pottery jugs in Georgia show that humans were making wine from grapes around 6000 BC. Meanwhile, at Haji Firuz Tepe in Iran, ancient jars hold traces of grapes and tree resin, suggesting an early type of preserved wine or flavored wine from very early on. The interesting thing is, these communities didn't have to learn from the same teacher. They probably figured out the same principle independently. Sugar, water, yeast, time, and a little patience. From then on, alcohol wasn't just part of a meal. It entered rituals, harvests, hosting guests, social status, and the collective memory of the community. Yeast didn't just change the flavor of a drink, it reshaped the relationships between people. Looking at it from here, a modern glass of alcohol starts to seem a lot less simple. Back in the day, yeast usually appeared when a community had a reason to gather. A harvest, a ritual, a farewell, a shared meal after many days of hard work. It wasn't just liquid in a jug, it's an excuse for everyone to gather around. And even today, that hasn't faded away. We still drink at weddings, at year-end parties, or when reuniting with an old friend. A drink sometimes makes it easier to open up the conversation, helps strangers loosen up, and helps a heavy day feel like a weight has been lifted. But the context has shifted. Alcohol today doesn't need rituals, doesn't need seasons, doesn't even need a community. It's sitting right there in the supermarket, in commercials, in the fridge, in drinking sessions, driven by peer pressure, and even on those nights, when someone drinks alone behind a phone screen. The issue probably isn't that drinking back then was better than now, but rather, are we using it to get closer to each other, or to avoid admitting the truth that we are just exhausted? It's the same drink, but not always the same kind of loneliness. But if we just stop at the image of people sitting around together, the story would be way too perfect, and not real at all. Alcohol has never been completely innocent. Even when it was born out of rituals, in shared meals, in an effort to pull people closer, it's still a substance that alters your body and behavior. It can soften a person's heart, but it can also make them lose control. It can open up a conversation, but it can also spark violence, dependency, ego trips, and decisions that the next morning nobody ever wants to bring up again. The past wasn't a paradise either. Ancient people didn't live in some poetic world by the fire. They faced diseases, famine, loss, and conflicts, and had very few ways to protect themselves when something harmful spiraled out of control. As for modern times, even with all the extra pressure, it also gives us medicine, safety laws, and a real understanding of addiction, alcohol-free options, and the right to say no more clearly. So, the point isn't to praise or condemn drinking. The scariest part is when the very thing that used to bring people together becomes a substitute for genuine connection. So, the next time you see a glass on the table, maybe you'll look at it a little differently. Not just as a fun drink for socializing, or to take the edge off an exhausting day. In that glass, there's the shadow of overripe fruit out in the wild, of grains being crushed in stone caves, of ancient clay pots, of sacred rituals, of harvests, and of bittersweet farewells. And of course, of those meals where people just tried to sit a little closer to each other. The most fascinating part isn't how ancient alcohol is. What's fascinating is that, from very early on, people knew that facing this world completely alone was just too hard. They needed fire, food, and shelter. But they also needed a shared moment, something to pass around, a reason to sit in silence together, or to finally say the things that are hard to say. That's where the beauty of drinking lies, but also its danger. Because when we forget about the person sitting right next to us, the glass easily becomes the main character. So, the final question probably isn't when our ancestors first started drinking, it's whether, after tens of thousands of years, we're still drinking to get closer to each other, or just looking for a way to feel less lonely in the silence.